Hello, class, and welcome to Chapter 8 on human population. We'll go over a little bit of the science of demography, the demographics of different countries, the stages, the age structure, population, quality of life, reducing the total fertility rate, and government policies and fertility. We'll talk a little bit about Africa first of all. The population of Africa when this book was written and continues to be rapidly growing, and the population estimates it actually a decreased rate in growth due to the HIV and AIDS infection rates and deaths. About 70% of new infections are within the sub-Saharan Africa, and many children are then orphaned when their parents die. The average life expectancy has actually dropped by 10 years in Africa, and as health declines, the labor shortages are occurring. So what is demography? So you can see that it kind of slowly increases in general, the human population, a very slow increase. We have a couple of things happening with plagues, the Black Death, other illnesses, but then we have this huge exponential growth since about 1980. And as of 2014, the population was 7.1. As of today, it's about 7.8 billion people. So here's the human population reached and how, it took till 1800 to reach 1 billion and how it has rapidly increased since 1800 to 7 billion. Population is increasing due to a decrease in death rate, not necessarily an increase in birth rate. And this is kind of good things, a greater food production, better medical care, better sanitation, the introduction of vaccines, improvements in water quality, sanitation. The growth rate, signified by the lowercase italicized r, has started to decline, and it will continue to decline until there's zero population growth, and an S curve may eventually replace that really steep J curve. The carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals of a given species that a particular environment can support for an indefinite period, assuming there are no changes in the environment. And we talked a little bit about this in Chapter 5. Both environmental constraints and human values will have an impact on K, the carrying capacity, and it's uncertain what the carrying capacity of the Earth is for humans. Current and future population numbers, so projections for 2050, which is now less than 20 years away, they say a low estimate is about 8.3 billion for Earth's population. A high estimate is 10.9, and most likely we're right under 10 at 9.6. Projections have increased since 2012 by about 500 million people. Here are the world's 10 most populous countries. Again, this textbook is a little outdated, so this is as of 2013, but trends have stayed fairly similar. We have China, India, and the United States, and then so forth, moving down the list. And you can see the population density as well, basically based on people per square kilometer. So India is very dense because it's a much smaller country. Bangladesh, even though it does not have the highest population, is a much smaller country, so it has a very high density. Population growth and population characteristics are not the same in all countries. So if we look at a developed country and we look at the fertility rate, projected population, infant mortality rate, and the life expectancy at birth, the per capita GNI, which is the gross national income, and then women using contraception, we see how developed countries such as the United States varied greatly from a moderately developed country like Venezuela, even though that is, again, a little bit outdated, or versus Ethiopia, which is less developed. The replacement level fertility, this is the number of children a couple must have to replace themselves. So we say it's about 2.1 children in order to replace yourself to do the jobs you're doing, to take care of the things that you're taking care of, and so forth. The total fertility rate worldwide is about 2.5 children. This is even decreased a little bit since this has been made. I think it's a little under 2 at this point. And it's more than replacement due to the level of fertility. Here are birth rates around the world. You can see that countries in Africa have very high birth rates. And then you can see lower birth rates in other countries. Again, not always, but many times the lower birth rates are due to education resources, women using contraceptives, many times in more developed countries, but not always. Demographic stages, we have a pre-industrial stage. where the birth and death rates are high and you have modest population growth, a transitional stage in which there's a lower death rate, we have rapid population growth, an industrial stage where we have the birth rate declining and the population growth slowing, and then a post-industrial stage where we have a post-industrial kind of growth where there's low birth and death rates, and that the population growth is very slow because the number of births are kind of equaling the number of deaths. So here we have these demographic stages, as you can see over here, looking at size of population, birth rate, and death rate, going through those 4 stages. Fertility changes in developing countries. So we have a total fertility rate, in the 60s, and then it has greatly decreased in these countries, except in places like Nigeria, where it hasn't decreased too much, but in other countries, since, as the fertility changes and rate have decreased greatly between 1960 and 2013. Age structure diagrams. These are really important for studying the demography of a population. These structure diagrams show the ages of the people and then male versus female. So we have rapid growth in Ethiopia. And you can see here, there's a lot of young kids in Ethiopia and a very low life expectancy. Not many people live past 55, 60 years old. So you have kind of this bottom half is heavy because most of the people are younger because they don't live as long. Slow growth is the United States and maybe other more developed countries where the number of kind of births is within these middle years, kind of between the ages of maybe 30 to 50. The majority of the population is in those middle years. Not many births and not many deaths as people will cycle through and up this age structure diagram. Population growth momentum. There's a potential for future increases or decreases in a population based on a current age structure. So for example, there's an increase seen when the largest population is in the pre-reproductive age group, which is about 26% of the world population. So if most of the world's people are in that pre-reproductive group, in about 10 to 20 years, we're going to see a rapid increase in growth. So here we see the percentage of people under the age of 18. We see Africa, Latin America is big. So in about 20 years, those countries will most likely have the greatest increase in population growth, which again, this textbook was written in 2013, 2014. We're already 10 years later, and that has seemed to be true. Low fertility rate usually leads to a larger elderly population. Most are retired and they're not a part of the workforce. And this can increase a country's tax burden and gives a very high percentage of disabled or chronically ill. And then the people maybe are not there to care for them. Effects of the aging population. So Japan has the longest life expectancy. We have a very good Japanese woman. She's 98 years old, and I wouldn't be surprised if she lives another 10 years. So I wish we could all have those genetics. For men, it's about 80 years old, and women, the average life expectancy is 86 years old. There's a low fertility rate and fears that the young may not be able to support this elderly population because they're living so long. So there's incentives to continue working past retirement. Russia, for example, has a fertility rate of 1.7, so it actually has a declining population, and they actually are giving out incentives for young to start families to try to keep up with the work and the labor shortage. So we have different problems for the world depending on what country you are. The population and quality of life can be difficult to meet basic needs in developing countries. Problems are associated with overpopulation. There's environmental degradation, hunger, persistent poverty, economic stagnation, urban deterioration, and health issues. And can the Earth sustainably support 9.6 billion people? Depends on the quality of life and the people, businesses, and governments potentially changing habits. Population and chronic hunger, so food security. This is a condition in which people do not live in hunger or fear of starvation, which thankfully none of us have to probably worry about where we are at. I'm not saying that's true for everyone, of course, but effects of a chronic hunger can decrease the immune system, and illnesses can be associated with that: malaria, measles, diarrhea. and acute respiratory illness. So this idea of chronic hunger and poverty lends itself to a whole gamut of issues. Food insecurity, these are conditions under which people live with chronic hunger and malnutrition, which can really mess up the health of the body. And solving the food problem could be controlling the population growth, promoting economic development of developing countries without adequate food supplies, and providing access to food and land resources to those who live in areas without them. There's two kind of viewpoints from economists based on population growth. One is that population growth stimulates economic development and technological innovation. And the other view is that rapid population expansion can hamper developmental efforts. Most observations support the second viewpoint, and in order for a country to increase its standard of living, its economic growth must exceed its population growth. Individual's behavior, the marriage age. Due to the high infant child mortality rates, the couple is expected to have a large number of children, and children are often working in the family business, as shown in this example, and religious values can also affect that as well. Social and economic status of women. So gender equality is common worldwide, especially in countries like Africa. There's disparities in political participation, social status, economic status, health, legal rights, education, employment, and earnings. And this is the illiteracy in 2002. Educational opportunities and fertility. So this graph is often shown, the average number born per woman is normally very high in countries where there's not a lot of education with women. Women with more education tend to marry later, have fewer children, as we can see in changes that have even happened in the United States in the past 50 years. Family planning services. These are services that enable both men and women to limit the family size, safeguard individual health rights, and improve the quality of life for themselves and their children. Government policy and fertility. Let's talk about China a little bit, because they have the largest population in the world. They kind of had a little bit of a controversial family planning policy where in 1971, the Chinese government actively pursued birth control. In 1979, there were incentives actually to promote later marriages and one-child families, including medical care, schooling for the child, preferential housing, and retirement funds. And it actually brought about a very rapid and drastic decrease in fertility rates. And then in 1979, the plan was put in place with incentives to promote later marriages, one-child families. These were the incentives. And if a second child was born, all incentives must be revoked or returned. And this decreased the fertility rate from 5.8 births per woman to 2.1 births per woman in 1981. And I'll let you guys decide for yourself if you think that was right or wrong or ethical. We don't get into that here. I'm just telling you basically just the facts based on the textbook. But why was that particular plan unpopular and very controversial? There was social pressure to abort the second child then, because the families knew that they would lose all these benefits. There was pressure to abort or even kill the first female child. And then as of 2000, there's actually a greater ratio of boys to girls. And the plan was much more relaxed in rural China. And the total fertility rate in 2011 was about 1.5. So government policy and fertility, let's talk about Mexico. They have a very young age structure. There's a huge potential for population growth because 30% of the population is under age 15. So they'll have, in 10, 20 years, all these babies being born. In 1974, the government imparted educational reform, family planning, healthcare. This was very successful. The total fertility rate dropped from 6.7 to 2.2, with maybe a little less controversial than what was going on in China. The Millennium Development Goals, so 189 heads of state met at the UN Millennial Summit to address the needs of the impoverished. And these were their action plans. And these are their development goals, many of them very noble. And I'll let you guys read through them. A lot of them are, increasing primary education, empowering women, gender equality, getting rid of hunger, combating AIDS, these diseases, ensuring environmental stability, sustainability, and developing a global partnership for economic development. How can developing country governments help? Increased money allotted to public health and family planning, education on methods of birth control, increased average level of education. And how can developed countries help? Provide financial support and supporting, research and development of new birth control methods. Highly developed nations can have problems of unsustainable consumption by affluent people. And I think this is most likely a look at Costco. What are the policies to support sustainable choices? Voluntary simplicity just as a way of life that involves wanting and spending less. Consumerism and materialism is so big in America, versus anywhere else in the world. And we just consume more than anywhere else in the world. We can downshift. You can voluntarily move from a lifestyle based on the accumulation of wealth and goods to maybe a tiny home. And I'm not saying you guys should live in tiny homes because I couldn't. I have 4 children. But just this idea of voluntarily kind of making a choice in consuming and being less materialistic. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you for the next chapter.